Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners. We thank you so much for taking time to listen, and we so appreciate it. If you're interested in finding out more about the Thomas Jefferson Hour, go to jeffersonhour.com. You can support the show. You can find out all about Clay's upcoming cultural tours, his online courses. I know you have one coming up for the Constitution. You have a John Steinbeck tour coming up, and lastly, you can support the show, which we so appreciate it. This week, it was a very interesting conversation. We spoke with Jefferson starting on the harmony of his cabinet, which is something I've heard about from you before, Clay, but this circular to his departments praising his cabinet heads was something I had not read before.
It's an amazing man, Thomas Jefferson. And he did really have one of the great and most harmonious cabinets in American history. Of course, he was a harmony obsessive. I mean, and that's just not a throwaway sentence. He could not live without harmony. He shrank from conflict. It makes him a terrible politician because politics is conflict. Politics is a way of settling extremely serious disputes without blood. And when it dribbles over into blood, as it did on January 6, 2021, that's not politics anymore. That's insurrection, or that's a riot. But Jefferson was a harmony devotee. He needed it. He was soft-spoken. He was understated. He was invariably well-mannered and civil. He made people feel special. He didn't take advantage. He didn't do cheap shots. He didn't undermine people. He treated everyone with agency and respect, which is what I love about Jefferson. And I'll tell you why I love this show. You know, these shows are spontaneous, they're unscripted, as I'm sure everyone can appreciate. We let them go in the direction they go. And the programs I like best are ones like today where at some point you wind me up and I try to explain the mystery of Thomas Jefferson, because I still don't know, David, after, 30-some years. And every once in a while you find a way, or maybe I just take the way, but something happens and I try to figure out what is it about this guy? What is it about this paradoxical, inconsistent genius / blind man? And we wrestle with it, and I try my hardest. I'm using every bit of, I'm sorry to say, I'm using every bit of what limited talents I have to try to make sense of this man, because I think it's so important. It's not just a hobby. It's not like solving a 10,000-piece picture puzzle. It's like, this is a puzzle we have to come to terms with because we're America. And this is one of our most gifted and problematic people, and that I'm never going to get it. I don't know what made Thomas Jefferson tick, and I want to, and I'm not ever going to give up. And so if the program were scripted, if we wrote all this out, if we knew where we were going with a tight outline, we couldn't do this. And this is, I think, what's valuable in what we do, is that there's no set program. It's an exploration. If it were overly produced, it might be better in terms of polish, but it would be worse in terms of the purposes of the humanities, which are to explore, to tease, to question, to ponder, to raise questions for which there's no obvious or even, in some cases, possible answer. And so I love that, and I love when you when you do it. I don't know how you do it, but then I think, wow, this is I'm learning from listening to myself wrestling with this stuff, and which is really very satisfying.
I think you're giving away too many secrets.
Really? I don't think people.
Yeah, we probably lost them already. Yeah.
There's not much mystery here anymore. But I think that the cabinet is amazing to think about. That Jefferson, I mean, I don't know how many people work in the White House per day, but it's hundreds. And then there are the number of people who work for the president per se. That's in the thousands. And then there are the number of people who work for the administration, which is in the tens of thousands.
A good correspondent on all this is Bo Wright. We haven't talked to him for a long time.
We got to get him.
Yeah.
Let's ask him these questions, because here's Jefferson with one secretary, period. That's him. Who worked for Jefferson? A secretary. First one, Meriwether Lewis. How many cabinet members did he have? 5 if you count Levi Lincoln. Who worked for them? The largest number of employees were in the Treasury Department because they were collecting revenues. And so a couple of hundred around the country, but only a tiny number in Washington, D.C. How many people worked for the federal government of the United States, including the judicial branch and the legislative branch and so on? Under 1,000, I would say, in the age of Thomas Jefferson. That includes every member of Congress. Well under 1,000, probably under 500. So I don't know how many members there were of the House and the Senate, but there were like 17 states, so 34 senators and 100 congressmen, something like that. Think of how tiny this all was. And we still try to draw comparisons. Today, people work directly for the President of the United States who have never met the President of the United States, and vice versa. They work for the President, not for the executive branch, and they've never met him.
Say that times were different then. Anyway, I really enjoyed that letter. I'm hoping we can get it posted on our website. Meanwhile, sir, it's time for us to go to the show. Any last words?
Yes, cultural tour, Steinbeck in March. Cuba's full, but we'll there's a waiting list, and we'll do it again. The Salmon River trip was so marvelous. We're going to do that next year, not the coming year. And then the 2 winter encampments, one on Charles Dickens. I just finished rereading Oliver Twist last night. What a wonderful novel that is. I've moved on to A Tale of Two Cities, which is a novel I don't know that well. I've only read it once, but I will be reading it several times before January. And the other one is on Lewis and Clark in winter. So this is something that you've done a little work on. So they wintered 3 times, once at Camp Wood opposite the mouth of the Missouri, a second time in North Dakota at Fort Mandan, 146 nights. And then the third was at Fort Clatsop out on the Pacific coast. And we paper over those. In the narratives, like a Stephen Ambrose book, you get up to Fort Mandan, and then you kind of skip a few little details and skip to the next year. Then you get them to Fort Clatsop, a few little details, and you skip to the return journey. So I'm concentrating on the 3 winters and everything you can learn, and some of it really important, about Lewis and Clark by concentrating on their downtime rather than their we proceeded on time. So those are all coming, lots and lots more. My book, I urge people to buy. I'm really proud of this book, The Language of Cottonwood's Essays on the Future of North Dakota, and on and on and on. But let's go to the show. Thank you, David. These 2 shows, this last couple of shows, where you've generated everything and done all the background work, have turned out to be really superb shows, and I thank you for your leadership.
Very good. You're welcome, sir.
And to the show.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson. Mr. Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay Jenkinson. I'm your host, David Swenson, and Mr. Jefferson, so good to see you again this week. I hope you are healthy and happy, sir.
Good to see you, my dear citizen.
I wanted to talk to you a little bit about your presidency this week, Mr. Jefferson. I, like many Americans, look to your presidency in broad historical terms, but we know you took office determined to roll back the Federalist programs of the 1790s. That is, to reduce taxes, the national debt, and government spending. You repealed the Alien and Sedition Acts, saw to the Louisiana Purchase, and authorized the Lewis and Clark expedition to explore the Louisiana Territory in the Pacific Northwest. What we don't consider enough, perhaps, is the day-to-day management of government you had to deal with, sir.
Things were simpler then, of course. I lived essentially alone in what you call the White House, although my secretary, Meriwether Lewis, occupied the East Room for a couple of years. He was my private correspondence secretary, and he was also in training for what became the Lewis and Clark expedition. But essentially, we lived like 2 mice in a church during that time. I didn't have a staff. I had 1 private secretary, and that was it. Imagine the executive branch of your government operating with so slender a staff. And I also made it a habit to examine every piece of paper. Anything written by any of my cabinet members had to go through me. And I didn't always read them. I trusted them, of course. I had one of the best and most harmonious cabinets, I think, in world history, much less American history. But I insisted that every piece of serious business that was done in any of the ministries come through my office so that I could stay abreast and know what was being done on my behalf by my trusted agents. And so that's an enormous amount of paperwork. And I think I remember that I was up at dawn, as always. I always got up before the sun, even during the White House years. But I would go to my writing table, and I would work essentially from 7 a.m. or so until midday, often seeing visitors late in the morning, such people as wanted to come confer with the president. And then I would go on a horseback ride of 5 miles, 10 miles, 20 miles, whatever it might be. But I rode horse every day, partly as a matter of maintaining my health. And then when I came back, I would dress for dinner, and we would have a modest meal. 3 times a week or so, I invited members of Congress or others to come and dine with me at the president's house. And when that ended, then I would go back to my writing table, perhaps read, perhaps just engage in puttering around my office, which was in what's now known as the state dining room. I had a pet bird, and I had plants to water and gadgets to play with and to tinker with and so on. So I was a very busy man, and I, as president, probably worked 10 to 15-hour days just handling the paperwork of the presidency.
Sir, I came across a letter you wrote during your first term in November of 1801, which is what we might call during my time a memo or memorandum, and it's titled Circular to the Heads of Departments. This document, I think, provides us with some real insight into your governing style. It reads in part, coming all of us into executive office now and unfamiliar with the course of business previously practiced, it was not to be expected we should in the first outset adopt in every part a line of proceeding so perfect as to admit no amendment. I read this as you being very open to change, sir, and suggestion.
Well, think of my predecessors, George Washington, the first president who served 2 terms, 8 years, and he also was a man of extraordinary responsibility who took his duties very seriously. So he set the tone. And John Adams, even though I think his presidency was a weak one, was a masterful reader and a brilliant administrator. And he had a command of constitutional history second to none in the world, perhaps. The only one who might rival him would be James Madison. And so I had some big shoes to fill here, and I wanted to get it right. And I take enormous pride in administrative mastery. I think that, frankly, that government is a few plain duties to be performed by a few honest men. In other words, just handling the paperwork, being an efficient administrator, taking care of the business of the White House, of the executive branch, and to a certain degree of the country. So I worked very hard at that, and I knew that coming in, I had been vice president for John Adams, but the fact is I was essentially kept out of all important business of his administration. I was never consulted. I was not at cabinet meetings. He and I did not have meetings. I was a vice president whose position was to preside over the Senate, which is what the Founding Fathers gave the vice president to do, to give him something to do. And then, of course, I was on call if something should happen to end Adams' life before his term ended. And so I didn't know what had happened during the Adams administration. I read about it like everybody else in the limited number of newspapers that the country had. So when I became president, you have to begin by looking around and finding out what's been done and what hasn't been done, what business was never finished by the previous administration, and you examine such paperwork as still is on the desk, and you have each of your cabinet ministers look at the paperwork in their departments and maybe consult with their predecessors. So you start with this reconnaissance. And once you've seen what they have done, then you begin to work on your own initiatives. But I wanted to make sure that there was enough flexibility in my administrative style that if we found out 6 months into my term or even 2.5 years into my term that there was a better way to do things, that we would adopt those innovations and not have any rigid system that would prevent us from making the kind of flexible changes that any dynamic society would require.
You mentioned Mr. Adams and sort of being left out of his administration. It's interesting in this memo or circular, as you call it, you do mention that the heads of departments have not been practiced exactly on the same scale in all of them. Well, that would be two administrations, so you obviously are pointing to Mr. Adams. But you say, having been a member of the first administration under General Washington, I can state with exactness what our course was. And you then detail how the system worked when you were Secretary of State for President Washington and write, I cannot withhold recommending to the heads of departments that we should adopt this course for the present, leaving any necessary modifications of it to time and trial.
Yes, so I had been a member of the Washington administration from 1790 until the last days of December 1793. Then I absolutely insisted on withdrawing from the administration. I had been subject to attacks in the press. I was regarded as a renegade in the Washington administration because I didn't always agree with the policies of that administration or its methods. And I found myself pitted against Colonel Hamilton, the Secretary of the Treasury, in ways that I found really degrading. I'm a harmony lover. And as I looked at my life, I was in my 50s. I couldn't understand why I would willingly put myself into a cockpit to fight with this Hamilton, who's so ambitious and egotistical and aggressive and masculine and wanting to invade other cabinet members' portfolios and generally treating himself as the prime minister of the United States. It seemed to me oppressive that no rational being would agree to do this. If I had been an effective cabinet member and had been able to persuade the administration to follow what I took to be the best course, if I had had persuasive capacity with George Washington and was regarded really as an asset rather than as a nuisance, I might have overcome my personal aversion to the conflicts of that administration and persevered. But when I realized that I was relatively ineffective, my happiness lay at Monticello. And so I retired. I tried to retire sooner, but George Washington kept asking me to stay on for the good of the country. During that time, I was able to observe his administration quite closely, and I approved of his administrative style, which was to have few cabinet meetings, to make sure that they weren't routine, but to call his ministers one by one in as he needed to speak with them, and when he needed more than one, to assemble them, but not to over-formalize the system. The president is the ultimate responsible agent for the national government of the United States, at least the executive branch of the national government. So I took many good lessons from the Washington administration. But then when I looked at the Adams administration, where I was technically a member because vice president, but effectively excluded from all real deliberations, even ceremonial events, I saw that his administration had been bedeviled by unloyal cabinet members. Those cabinet members, which were holdovers from the Washington administration, never warmed to Mr. Adams, and they distrusted him in some important respects, undermined his authority in some ways that I find appalling. And they answered not to the president, their master, but they answered to Colonel Hamilton off in New York. He had retired and was in private law practice in New York City, but he was effectively the shadow president. And these disloyal cabinet members were communicating with him without letting Adams know this. And when Adams finally realized that they were betraying him, to the point, I think, almost of treason at times, he got rid of them. But it was too late. His one-term presidency was compromised, I think fatally, by the lack of a real cabinet of people that he could trust for their honest advice. So I determined not to let that happen. So two things happened. One, I went back to the Washington style of a few cabinet meetings, but having bilateral relationships with my cabinet ministers. There were only four of us. And secondly, I made sure that the people that I brought into the cabinet were people of my own political stamp, and that we had a level of personal harmony in addition to our professional mutual respect. And so I think honestly say that I may have had one of the most harmonious administrations and cabinets in the history of the world.
Mr. Jefferson, we need to take a short break from this conversation. When we return, I'd like to return to this circular you wrote, sir. We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson. Mr. Jefferson, we've been talking about this circular to the heads of departments that you wrote during your first term, and I wanted to come to the close of it. You wrote, "If I had the universe to choose from, I could not change one of my associates to my better satisfaction." This is the kind of executive that I think most Americans would like to work for. You are open to suggestions and change. You actually say if there's a better way to do things, go ahead and do it without approval. It marks your, as you say, great desire for harmony in your cabinet.
Because we didn't meet often. I should tell you that my cabinet consisted of 4 people. So James Madison was the Secretary of State. My Secretary of the Treasury was Albert Gallatin. The person I knew least in the cabinet was Robert Smith. Robert Smith was the Secretary of Navy. He was not my first choice. He was the brother of somebody that I greatly trusted, and he turned out to be an able minister, but it was not a position that anyone wanted because I was known to be no great friend to a Navy because of their expense. Secretary of War, what you would call Secretary of Defense, but then called Secretary of War, was Henry Dearborn, who was outstanding at what he did, and I don't believe we ever disagreed about anything, really. So those were the 4 principal members: Secretary of State, James Madison; Secretary of the Treasury, Albert Gallatin; Secretary of the Navy, Robert Smith; and Secretary of War, Henry Dearborn. And then there was sort of a 5th. Levi Lincoln was the Attorney General, but the business of the judicial branch was so small at that time that the person did not have to live in Washington and was not expected to retire from other business interests. He could be a lawyer in private practice at the same time he handled such limited legal business as there was for an Attorney General of the United States. And I ask you to repeat my statement of the deep harmony. I don't think that I could have dialed up in any way from any quarter a better cabinet than I had.
Yes, you wrote, "If I had the universe to choose from, I could not change one of my associates to my better satisfaction." I'm glad you brought up Mr. Lincoln, sir. We've established that it was your first term. You did all you could to establish harmony amongst those in your cabinet. There have been politicians who, after being elected to office, used their newfound power to settle old scores. I don't believe you did that, sir, but you were determined to show success in your principles and governing. And you wrote to Levi Lincoln in October of 1802 saying, "I shall take no other revenge other than a steady pursuit of economy and peace, and by the steady establishment of Republican principles, in substance and in form, to sink federalism into an abyss from which there shall be no resurrection of it." So you weren't really taking revenge, but you were out to destroy the opposition.
Well, destroy is a strong term. I wanted to show by excellence and administrative mastery that my principles, my political principles, those of the emerging Republican Party, were superior to those of the high Federalists. The Federalists were really an aristocratic and monarchical party, happy with a national debt, eager for the nation to supplant the states as the centers of sovereign authority, militaristic in many respects, commercially reckless, I think, reckless in federal spending and so on. And so I wanted to show by a better example what an American, what a small r Republican administration could do. And I think we did that. I think it was an extraordinary experiment. I later said to James Madison, very late in my life, I think my last letter to him, in fact, that never in the history of the world, in my opinion, was there a group of people who were more dedicated to the happiness of humanity. Many administrations miscarry for one reason or another, or the president winds up being a proto-tyrant, or has autocratic tendencies, or tries to get revenge on his enemies, or pursues a path that's personally interesting to him, but is not really good for the Commonwealth. Things can go wrong in administrations, and they do. I think in the history of the world, and I know that sounds like a pretty strong statement, it would be hard for anyone to find a group of men, my cabinet and some others who were in the periphery of my administration and state governors and so on, who really were more dedicated to pursuing the best policies for human happiness and for humans to thrive on Earth than existed in my lifetime. That there was nothing selfish in anything that I did. There was no self-dealing. I avoided speculation in Western lands because I knew that I might have to adjudicate some questions there. I took no emoluments of any sort, just the opposite. I sent back gifts when the world's largest cheese was brought to me in the White House. I sent them a check for $200 because I didn't want to accept even something as whimsical as a giant cheese, lest it be seen as an emolument or a violation of the principle of avoiding conflict of interest. And so I would defy anyone, anywhere, to find in my administration anything that was not high-minded. My policies may have been errant. I might have pursued policies that others could disagree with, but nobody could say that I was doing it for personal reasons. And the closest I ever came to that was the impeachment of Samuel Chase, the Supreme Court Justice, who had denounced me and denounced the Declaration of Independence and denounced the democracy and had browbeaten lawyers from the bench and so on. We did impeach him at the end of my first term, and he was tried early in 1805 and acquitted. That was the closest I ever came to having a vendetta, and it wasn't really about him. It was about the damage I think that he was doing to the integrity and the independence of the judiciary. We didn't always agree in my cabinet, and there were times when we disagreed strongly. There was a civility, and we always worked out a consensus. I made them know that I took their views very seriously, but in the end, I had to make the decision. It was my administration. I would be held accountable. I was the responsible agent.
Sir, I must return to your comment about my use of the word destroy and you calling it a strong term. I think it hails next to your written sentence, which was to sink federalism into an abyss from which there shall be no resurrection of it. It's clear that you regarded Federalist policies of Mr. Hamilton and your predecessor as a real betrayal of your Republican ideals. But didn't this mean that you had to reject the vast powers held by the federal government outlined by the Constitution?
I didn't reject those powers. In fact, I used the powers more than I was comfortable with. The historians have said that I was more Hamiltonian as president than at any other time in my life, and that I had learned my lesson from my failed governorship at the end of the war, when I had underrated the description of powers of the executive. I had erred on the side of limited executive authority when the state was really needing some stronger leadership, and I was so heavily criticized for that. Formally investigated by the House of Delegates for malfeasance during that crisis in Virginia, something I've never got over and am not over yet. So when I became president, I was determined not to ever make the mistake again of underestimating the importance of power in certain circumstances, of asserting power. And so I turned out to be a quasi-Hamiltonian president in some regards, and particularly with respect to the Louisiana Purchase and later our behavior during the embargo crisis. But yes, I destroyed federalism by showing that there was a better path. And so I proved that in the course of my administration, and I think that did sink federalism. I won all but 2 states. My first election in 1800 was narrow and contested, as you know, but my second one was an overwhelming endorsement of my policies. It was a landslide. mandate. And so that's the refutation of federalism, and the Federalist Party never recovered. I mean, it literally never recovered. I was followed by Madison for 2 terms. He was followed by Monroe for 2 terms. Monroe was followed by John Quincy Adams, who by now was essentially a Jeffersonian, for 1 term. He was followed by Andrew Jackson, who was a radical Democrat, but still from our side of the political equation. And so federalism went into deep eclipse. It never recovered. Some of those principles reemerged later in politics beyond my time. There will always be, of course, there will always be the quarrel between the few and the many, the tiny minority of the most wealthy and privileged people, and then all of the rest of us. It goes back to ancient Rome and beyond. But those issues did not reassert themselves much in the course of my lifetime. And so we did sink federalism into an abyss. And I'll tell you why, sir. Because we believe in humans. We believe in the rights of man. We believe in the dignity of the American citizen. We believe in something like equality. We believe that every human being should be treated identically in the machine of the law, and that it would be a fatal and Faustian bargain for us to establish a class system in the United States and a system of privilege. That's old world thinking, and it failed to produce human happiness in the old world. Why would we possibly want to reinstall an aristocracy and a monarchy and all that comes with it in the United States? This was Hamilton's view, not mine, and the American people repudiated it, and they were right to repudiate it.
Mr. Jefferson, I also wanted to speak to you about foreign entanglements, wars to be more specific. America's been involved in military operations in the nation of Afghanistan for nearly 20 years, and the current administration is bringing our involvement to an end, resulting in a rapid takeover by opposition forces. It's been reported that 70% of the American public supports our withdrawal. However, it is going to be unjust for many and sadly bloody for many more. It will leave a stain on America in many people's view. Sir, you were the first American president to commit troops to a foreign war against the Barbary Pirates. Do you have any wisdom you can share with citizens concerned about this?
I did not wish to be a wartime president. I think it's too late in the world's history to solve our disputes with bloodshed and muskets and cannons. I want peace in America. I want peace in the world. Peace is my passion. If they had just left us alone, we would have been quite content. There was no aggressive, warlike element in my character, just the opposite, perhaps too much the opposite, as I learned during my time as governor at the end of the American Revolution. But I had been observing the Barbary Pirates for several decades, and here they were, these northern African Islamic pirate states, where there was sort of privateering, in other words, unofficial war being waged. It wasn't official warfare by those states of Tripoli and Morocco and so on. But unofficially, those states were quite happy with the piratical behavior of their radical Islamics. And so I had observed this in my time before I went to Europe, and I particularly observed it during the 5 years I spent in France. And I believed that civilization was going to have to stand up to these barbarians. And I urged John Adams to work with me to try to create a European coalition, including America, where we would send a squadron, a multinational squadron of naval ships to patrol those waters. This would lessen the cost of any one nation's commitment to this, but it also would show that civilization had a unified phalanx against such piracy and barbarism. But we didn't get it done. John Adams was skeptical of that sort of international cooperation, and it didn't happen then. But when I came back to this country, the predation by the Islamic pirates continued, and they would board our ships, steal what was on them, kidnap and ransom our sailors, sometimes torture them. They would give them the ultimatum of either becoming converts to Islam or being enslaved or worse. And we paid exorbitant ransom fees. I felt that only encouraged them, of course. You never want to encourage terrorists or pirates of any sort. And so finally, when I was president, more of the same depredations occurred. I called my first cabinet meeting of all of my cabinet meetings, in fact, in May of 1801 to address this. And although I was exceedingly reluctant to send a squadron across the ocean to the Mediterranean, especially without explicit congressional supervision, my cabinet members said I had no choice, that as commander-in-chief, I must protect American interests that far away. And so I sent a naval squadron and some Marines there, as you know, and we eventually, in a long, protracted, undeclared war, managed to prove our point and make it painful enough for those Islamic states to continue that they finally came to terms with us, and that kind of depredation ended, at least for that time. And so my hope is that no president ever has to face this. I would much prefer it if Congress had taken the lead. Of course, we turned it to Congress just as soon as they came back into session. I hate to see any president using force without explicit congressional authorization. That's the spirit of a republic. That's the spirit of our Constitution. But there are times when you just have to do what it takes to protect American citizens, American nationals, and American interests. And so I fought that war with as little cost as possible. And I did not want to shed a lot of blood. I merely wanted to make the point. But I was not going to allow this system of ransoming to continue. I find it fundamentally degrading to pay ransom to Islamic pirates or any other pirates in the world. So, you know, the problem with being the president of the United States is you have to face the contingencies that cross the transom that come to you. You can't choose your issues. You wish you could, but you have to face the world as it presents itself to you. And I reluctantly undertook this small war against the Algerian and Moroccan pirates.
Lastly, Mr. Jefferson, and this is a difficult question that I am going to present to you, and that's, if America does, in fact, stand for something new under the sun, do we have an obligation to assist other nations in their struggles for liberty? And liberty may mean different things to different peoples.
No. Our business is to create the most extraordinary civilization that ever existed. If we will do that, if we will work to perfect ourselves, then we will present that model to the world, and that model is much more potent than any rifle or any cannon or any naval squadron could ever be. And so, no, it is not in our interest to interfere elsewhere, even when we see people suffering or a broad humanitarian crisis. First of all, we can never know enough. You know, these are very seldom black and white situations where there is a good element and an evil element. It's usually much more complex and gray than that. And our deciding to choose one side or another based on very limited intelligence is a formula for disaster. You know, the pitch doth defile, as the Bible says. If you get involved in these things, you will degrade your national integrity. You cannot help that. And so we should show forbearance. We should, of course, encourage the rights of man everywhere, but we should do so by creating an example, the world's most important experiment in the search for human happiness. And that if we do that, the rest of the world will want to be America, and that will be stronger than the greatest artillery that could ever be leveled against another nation.
Sir, as always, I thank you for yet another enlightening conversation.
You are welcome, my friend.
We're going to take a short break. When we return, we'll be joined by the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, the man who portrays President Jefferson, Mr. Clay Jenkinson. We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. We are now joined by the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson. Good to see you, sir.
My friend David Swenson, the semi-permanent guest host of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I bring you greetings from your friends around the country, all of whom always ask about you. First, whether you exist, and second of all, whether you travel. And I assure them that I know the answer to the second one, and not necessarily to the first one.
Yeah, I talked to Beth, your able handler, last week, and she said, if you ever want to go on the Lewis and Clark tour, I can set it up for you. And I explained to her that, this is a real failing of mine, but my summers are just like wall to wall. I have all of these projects, and I barely have time to water my garden, let alone get out camping. And somewhere I'm going to grow up and grow the wisdom to change all that, but not this summer.
I see. Well, look, everyone understands that you're a homebody, and I admire it, and I wish I were home more often than I am. But I do assure you that if you ever want to make one of these trips, we will comp you with joy and add an extra ration of whiskey to your gill cup.
I heard there's a rumor floating around. I heard that it's possible Joe Ellis may join you on one of these.
Oh, so he says, but I know Joe Ellis. Joe Ellis is a friend of mine. Has been for a long time.
I'm no Joe Ellis.
He's a man of comfort. He's reached the point. He's eminent. His eminence is such that he's reached the point in his life where he doesn't want to be hauling any canoe around much or climbing any mountain.
He said if he could bring his fly rod, he might consider.
Well, we're going to certainly call his bluff, but we'll see how that works out. I'm sure he'll get diphtheria just before the event. So I'm holding in my hands a book written by an old friend of mine and protege, sort of. I taught her when she was an undergraduate at Pomona College in Claremont, California, Joanne B. Freeman. And she and a man named Johann Neem have a book called Jeffersonians in Power. But listen to the subtitle. Jeffersonians in Power. The rhetoric of opposition meets the realities of governing. You see how snarky that
title.
is?
That's
a
great,
snarky Hamiltonian title. I haven't read it, so I need to give it that benefit. And of course the essays.
Well, if she's a former student of yours, you must give her credence.
Well, no, she's brilliant. She's one of the best history professors in the country. She's an amazing human being and scholar, and I have great respect for her. But even when I taught her before I was Jefferson, I could see Hamiltonian tendencies. And she's one of those people who sees through Jefferson. As you know, we've been through this. You and I have been through this. At some point, anyone who falls in love with Thomas Jefferson gets this disillusionment where you see through him and you realize, okay, he's a slaveholder, and he dispossessed Indians, and there's Sally Hemings, and he was often duplicitous, and he had Machiavellian tendencies, and he had kind of a Teflon character, which always allowed him to pretend that he was above all of this. And it's hard to get a straight answer from Jefferson, and his mind moves so whimsically across space and time and ideas that he's hard to pin down. And in some ways, he's not fully reliable in, say, the way that John Adams is reliable. You know where he stands. You know what he thinks. There's never duplicitous. And Washington is reliable, and Madison is reliable, and James Monroe or Chief Justice John Marshall. These are all more reliable people than Jefferson because they don't hide anything. And so she's always had this view that Jefferson was a problem, that you could never finally pin him down on anything that really mattered.
That's part of why I wanted to talk about this circular to the heads of departments this week that I stumbled across, because we have these big picture judgments of Jefferson, and you just listed them all, so I won't. But day-to-day interactions with Jefferson are sort of detailed in this. He took his cabinet and said, hey, you guys are great. I couldn't ask for anybody better. I trust you. Do what you think is right. You'll have my support. And who wouldn't want that?
People admired Jefferson in his time. So Madison not only admired Jefferson, but loved him. And Gallatin realized, first, that Jefferson saw Gallatin's genius when the Federalists and a lot of know-nothings and America Firsters and so on hated Gallatin because he had a French accent and he wasn't born here. And so that sort of nonsense that continues to this day. And Jefferson saw the genius of Gallatin and, of course, loved him even as much for his love of Indian languages as he did for Gallatin's fiscal capacities. And then there was Robert Smith. Jefferson didn't particularly love or admire him, but he knew he was able, and he didn't really care much about the Naval Department anyway. And Henry Dearborn was like the best kind of Jeffersonian head of the War Department, because you have to have somebody who can wage war when you need it, but you want somebody who's reluctant to do so. And so that was exactly the politics of Henry Dearborn. So Jefferson was fortunate. He was a great selector of talent and a nurturer of talent. And so he got this cabinet, and it was just as harmonious as Jefferson says. And they went through some very difficult times together, and they got through it. But Jefferson, we can never fully come to terms with Jefferson's administrative mastery. And he collected this great set of talents around him. And then the problem was he confronted the real world. And that's what Joanne Freeman's talking about, that the real world is messy. You get involved in the embargo crisis. You want to buy New Orleans and you wind up with Louisiana. You inherit all these difficulties. So he's just feeling his way through this, and he did a masterful job. But he so defined the presidency as a very limited sort of thing that he didn't do the great things that a FDR-like president would do. Jefferson's view was, I'll just handle the paperwork as well as it can possibly be handled and hope for the best. And he largely succeeded.
You're talking about Joanne Freeman,
yes.
Is that correct?
Joanne B. Freeman.
And one of those, quote, people who saw through Jefferson,
yes.
I think is the way you put it. I was doing, in working on notes for the shows this week, I was thinking about that, there are people, and we know this from mail we get, who just flat out will have nothing to do with Jefferson, will give him no consideration because he was a slaveholder, and some of the other awful things that have been pinned to his name that he's responsible for. I'm thinking, okay, what could Jefferson have done as a slaveholder during his time? I mean, he could have given up Monticello and moved north. How could he have extricated himself from the position he was in that he is so criticized for now?
Well, there are a couple of things he could have done. I'm with you. I mean, when he said he had the wolf by the ears, that was an accurate trope. But he could have lowered his spending, because he didn't wind up owning his slaves. They were all mortgaged, and so he never really got serious about fiscal responsibility at home, although he was very serious about it for the country. He could have done that. He could have downsized. I mean, he could have gone into a modified limited Thoreau and said, I can't maintain Monticello and Poplar Forest. I'm going to sell them off for what little he would have gotten for them and move into a modest little house.
And by the way, you 5 dozen people who depend on me for shelter and food and everything else, you're on your own, right?
He would have, of course, wanted to do more than that, but it would have been hard to think of what he could really have done. I mean, how do you release slaves into a world where there's no place for them, for freed blacks?
Well, it was illegal. It was illegal under Virginia law.
Yes. So look, I'm with you that this is a very, very complex and difficult situation. But I think when you said what more could he have done, the answer is more. I think the answer is more. Yeah. And that he didn't do more. He got complacent. He learned to live with it. He kind of shrugged it off. He thought the next generation.
It was a great life he had there. He would have had to give all of it up to get out of slavery. And I suppose that's the judgment, is that, yeah, you should have done that.
There's that key letter that I think I've mentioned before with you a long time ago, though, that he wrote about Dabney Carr, his closest friend. Dabney died young, buried at the cemetery at Monticello, the pact they made of who was buried there first and who would follow. But Dabney got married to Jefferson's sister. And Jefferson wrote this really interesting letter in which he said, he has a modest little house and a few chairs and a table and some other furniture, and they eat bacon and they live this modest life, and he seems very, very happy. And he writes this letter, and you can tell there's a certain puzzlement, I could be that person. I could be modest. I could not buy every book that I want. I could avoid spending a fortune on wine. I could stop building and rebuilding and building and rebuilding Monticello and then building a very expensive second home. I could, and you can hear, behind the exquisite prose of this letter, you can hear Jefferson thinking, choice, we choose. And the fact is, David, that he chose the other path. And my view is sort of a paradoxical one, that he couldn't be Jefferson unless he was that extravagant person who saw a new chronometer and had to have it, who saw a new book and wanted to buy it, who thought of a new thing he could do with the building at Monticello and had to tear it down and start again. That it's impossible to imagine Jefferson living in a modest home. Jefferson.
Well, he was the patriarch. And I mean, when I said earlier, by the way, you 6 people who are dependent upon me, I'm not talking about just enslaved people. I'm talking about his extended family and the visitors and what was expected of him. I'm not trying to justify what he did, but I'm trying to understand it.
I hear you, and I, in many respects, agree with you. I think we've both agreed the answer is what more could he have done is more. So the question is then, what more? I think that we would look, let's just say this. Let's say that in 1809, when he finished the presidency, he came back and he said, this is unsustainable and it's also unjust. And so I'm going to build a new modest little framed house. I'm going to sell off some of my lands. I'm going to find ways to free slaves if it's possible, if there's a way to help supervise that. I'm going to try to detach myself in some measurable and meaningful way from this morass that I'm engaged in, this wolf by the ears. If we had done that and we had any evidence of that, David, we would like him better, wouldn't we? If he had shown the capacity to try that.
Sure. He could have followed Adam's lifestyle.
Yeah, so it's hard to think that he would shovel his own manure and, have a little hay crop and milk a cow. It's hard to think of Jefferson doing any of those things because instead he's calculating an eclipse. He's writing a treatise. He's translating a Greek text. He's trying to learn Gaelic so he can read Ossian. That's Jefferson. We love this Jefferson. He's ordering wine. He's looking through wine catalogs and thinking, that's a good vintage. I'll try that. He's only Jefferson if he's a Renaissance man. If he's Jefferson who's just sort of a modest Virginia planter who's downsizing, he's no longer Jefferson. And so he's inextricably tied to the lifestyle. It's a dumb word, but the set of values, decisions, habits, purchases, ways of seeing, ways of behaving that he had, hospitality to anyone who comes.
You don't think it's just as simple as that he really liked it? He really liked the position. He liked being lauded over, and he wasn't about to give that up even at the cost of enslaving other people.
No, I think he wouldn't have said this.
No.
But I think he thought, I am so fortunate to get to do this, to get to buy this stuff and use a theodolite and a surveyor's tools and to calculate stuff and to write a little Anglo-Saxon grammar and, to measure the peaks of otter and to send a learned exploration mission into the heart of the country, and they'll bring back data and water maybe from the source of the Missouri River. I think that he loved that. He wanted to be that guy. I mean, who doesn't want to be that? I would be that guy.
And at the same time, I was looking into the White House, and he called the White House, quote, a pleasant country residence with an excellent society, and quite enough of it. Went on to say it was, quote, big enough for 2 emperors, 1 pope, and the Grand Lama in the bargain. So, I mean, he wasn't above criticizing this opulence that he lived in.
He didn't even see it as opulence, David. He saw it as, like, these are the stuff you want. He didn't think it was luxury. He thought because it's so high-minded. Monticello becomes an exemplum of a Palladian home on a hill, and Jefferson was able to justify everything he did as somehow high-minded and creative and helping to build habits for an American extraordinary experimental civilization. And he never once thinks, how can I justify this stuff that I do, like the endless debt and the crop rotation systems that don't work out, and
the enslavement of people in particular. I mean, if he hadn't been a slave owner, none of the rest of this would matter. I mean,
but if he hadn't been a slave owner, he couldn't have lived this way.
Yeah.
In other words, he lived like a very rich person, but he wasn't. He lived like a European aristocrat, but he didn't have the means. He was doing it in two ways. He was doing it on borrowed money and getting into colossal debt in the course of this, and he was doing it by getting his bread from the sweat of another man's brow, as Lincoln put it in the second inaugural address. And he learned to live with both of them, both the debt and the exploitation of black slave labor. And once in a while, you see him squirm and wring his hands a little, and then he goes right back to his wine
catalog. Well, as a young
catalog.
man, he did try to, I don't know if you want to say end or moderate slavery in Virginia, but
yes,
the laws were
he
against him. Public opinion was against him. It's no excuse, but it's way too complex for us to decide this week because we're about out of time.
But can I say something?
You
in a completely
always
different...
can. It's your show.
I know, but I want to say something that's really important to me. You know, we talked about the cabinet, and he had this truly harmonious cabinet. He wasn't exaggerating. Jefferson said, flattery is not an American art. People did not flatter Jefferson. Jefferson did not like that. He would have put a stop to that. And when I think of the previous administration and that famous cabinet meeting where they went around the room and everyone abased himself and said what it was the greatest privilege in human history to be able to work for that president. And it was flattery and slavish flattery and self degradation. It was something you'd expect in North Korea. Jefferson could never, he would have walked out of that meeting. The first person who flattered him in that kind of a way, Jefferson would have said, I'm sorry, I'm not feeling well, and he would have excused himself. And so what I love about Jefferson is that he is exactly what you want in a figure of power. He underuses his power. He uses his power with dignity. He doesn't lord it over the people that he's working with. He has deep respect for others. He listens, and he is insusceptible to flattery. And I think we have seen, not just in the most previous administration, but in lots of them, that we've moved into a very much different sort of polity. And I think one reason I love Jefferson is that he reminds us that it can be done with great integrity under the right circumstances. We'll see you all next week for another important edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any show for a $12 donation, please call 701-575-0727. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C Major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program through the eyes of Thomas Jefferson.